I'm Greg Albo at York University with the Socialist Project and Center for Social Justice. The talk today is by Clyde Barrow, a leading Marxist state theorist from the Department of Political Science at the University of Texas, speaking on the deconstruction of the American state. It would be difficult to open this event today without recognizing the struggle going on and the conflict going on with Sudan peoples on the west coast over the pipelines. This, of course, is one of the most evident things occurring right now in the country around the Canadian colonial state practices that still exist as a central part of the Canadian state. It's incumbent on us in this context to recognize the historical territories of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, the Seneca, Huron-Wendat, and others in this territory. This has been subject to the so-called dish with one spoon treaty, as we term it in English, dealing with the ecological sharing and maintenance of the conditions of the Great Lakes and surrounding regions, which is obviously with the pipeline struggle. It's such a central issue in all these things, and this is still in some different degrees the contested territory, dealing with the Mississaugas of the New Credits. There's still some issues related to the settlements that have occurred. Today's talk on the deconstruction of the American state, I'm very much looking forward to. Clyde is one of those thinkers. I'm just meeting him 2 minutes ago, but I've met him late at night in his books and articles over the years many times. He's kept me up late at night puzzling over different things of state theory, but also because his writings on state theory, Marxist state theory, have been some of the best and most erudite accounts of Marxist state theory over the last 30, 40 years. Not only for his incredible catalog of knowledge of all the writing, but also his own insights. And he'll bring some of his own insights on this to the discussion of the American state with all its peculiarities, abnormalities, fetishisms, craziness of the American capitalist state in the time of Trump. I'm going to turn it over to Clyde. Welcome, Clyde.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. Let me start by saying that this is a paper in progress. I'll read some of it, I'll wing some of it, and some of it I'll kind of make up as I go. And the further we go, the more we'll get into that. But just to give you an idea of what I'm trying to do, this is really an idea that only came to me literally a day or two before Leo called and asked if I'd be able to give this talk. Suddenly I realized when he asked for the abstract that I would actually have to write something in order to present it. But one of the things that I'm trying to do when I use the phrase deconstruction of the American state is sort of deal with Donald Trump and the Trump presidency, and to try to convey the idea that this is not just Donald Trump, that this is a movement, that it's a big movement to deconstruct the American state. And when I use that phrase, what I also then go back to the very beginnings of state theory. Some of this will be very boring to those of you who are familiar with it, that if you're going to talk about deconstructing the American state, we then have to first start with what is the state, and then move on to the question of what would it mean to deconstruct a liberal democratic state from the inside, which I think is what is being done, and then a series of case studies to sort of illustrate and exemplify how that is occurring, and finally to the question of who would want to do such a thing and why, and finally the questions that I have not even begun to puzzle over but that I think are very important is sort of asking the question, is Trump smashing the state for us? What does this mean for the left, or is he really just eliminating every last vestige of liberal protection that is available for the left to dissent within? What does capitalism look like after the American empire, because he has declared his intent to withdraw? What does the world look like after the American empire, if indeed Trump is allowed to follow through with this? So those are that's what I'm trying to do here, so I'll just get right into the paper and start with the idea that on January 20th, 2017, Donald Trump, we all know, was a billionaire New York real estate investor, was inaugurated as the 45th President of the United States. The fact that Donald Trump was unlike any other candidate for the office has been apparent since he announced his bid for the U.S. presidency in January of 2016, by descending down a gold escalator in his famous Trump Tower to announce his bid for the U.S. presidency. Trump promised to make America great again, and throughout his campaign and his inaugural speech, he painted a dystopian portrait of the United States as a broken country while repeatedly declaring that I alone can fix it. His fixes include the construction of a 2,000-mile-long, big, beautiful wall to stop illegal immigration from Latin America. He described the immigrants as criminals and rapists, even though most of the immigrants at the U.S. southern border where I live are women and children fleeing violence and abuse in their home countries. He promised to reverse the new global order that had destroyed the American working class through globalization, and he was going to do that by imposing tariffs to discourage imports. He was going to negotiate good deals with China and Europe. He promised to withdraw the United States from international treaties on trade, climate, and security because they cost too much money and they had destroyed American jobs. And suddenly Europe, Japan, and South Korea were no longer American allies. They were deadbeats who took advantage of the United States. Many of his ideas, of course, were not only not politically correct in American politics, many of his suggestions were outright unconstitutional. They were illegal. But as Trump recently said just a few days ago, radical judges invent laws that Congress never passed. So those alleged laws and judicial interpretations of the U.S. Constitution have no binding effect on him as the president. And that, in a sentence, is what we call the theory of the unitary executive, of which William Barr is one of the chief proponents going back to the 1980s. So what I first want to do is start with the question of who is Donald Trump? And what I really want to emphasize is that when Donald Trump announced his bid for the U.S. presidency, he was already well known to Americans. Anybody who says they didn't know what they were voting for is not telling you the truth. Donald Trump was a regular story in gossip rags like the National Enquirer and the New York Daily News. He made frequent appearances on nationally broadcast Howard Stern radio show, as well as appearances in the mainstream media on the Oprah Winfrey Show and Barbara Walters. Trump appeared regularly in the pages of People magazine before eventually starring in the top-rated television series The Apprentice. So what did we know about Donald Trump by 2016? We know that Donald Trump was not the self-made billionaire and business genius that he promoted in his ghost-written book, The Art of the Deal. Trump began receiving a $200,000 a year allowance as a 3-year-old, and he was a millionaire by the age of 8. He received $1 million a year from his father after graduating college. In total, Trump received $413 million from his father's real estate empire, which was earned partly through illegal tax avoidance. It's in court right now. He claims he only received $1 million loan from his father as a startup investment, but we know that's not quite true. He later received another $177 million in cash when his father's real estate empire was sold off in 2004. And as one analyst has documented, if Donald Trump had taken all of this money and invested it in municipal bonds and done nothing else, he would be wealthier today than even he claims. So, in effect, he lost money. Now, we also know that Donald Trump was undisciplined and unruly as a child. So his father sent him to a private military academy. Many in the media have speculated that he has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and abuses prescription Adderall, which could account for why he refuses to release his medical records in the public like other past presidents. Nevertheless, his father's generous donation to the Wharton School of Business eventually eased his admission into that prestigious institution, and he never tires of boasting to us that he has an Ivy League degree. Indeed, whenever his intellectual credibility is questioned or mocked, as it often is in the press, Trump is quick to remind everyone, and I quote, "I went to the Wharton School of Finance. I'm like a really smart person." Trump's college degree actually remains clouded in mystery. Wharton will not release a copy of it. But there is a former Wharton professor who he had, William T. Kelly, who is quoted as saying, "Donald Trump was the dumbest goddamn student I ever had." And he subsequently went on to prove that. He started his business career in 1973 by being sued by the U.S. Department of Justice for racial discrimination in his apartment buildings, which was later settled with a consent decree. He went on to bankrupt his businesses 6 times despite receiving numerous financial bailouts from his father. He was notorious for leaving banks, bondholders, and equity investors holding the bag for his reckless business decisions while rarely putting much of his own money at risk. By the early 1990s, Trump's reputation was so ignominious in the financial world that no U.S. bank would lend him money, so he turned to foreign sources such as Deutsche Bank, who's now being prosecuted for money laundering for the Russians. And according to his own son, Donald Trump Jr., by 2008, quote, "We see a lot of money pouring in from Russia. Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of our assets." Trump has routinely reneged on payments to small business vendors to the point of driving them to bankruptcy. He regularly employs undocumented workers at his golf clubs, hotels, and resorts and then cheats them out of their wages. He destroyed a once profitable airline shuttle, failed at the mail-order steak business, failed at the bottled water business, and defrauded thousands of Trump University students out of their tuition. It's even been documented recently that he stole from his own private charity by diverting funds into his struggling businesses that were intended for wounded veterans. In fact, Donald Trump, if you can imagine this, has been involved in more than 4,500 lawsuits over his lifetime, nearly 100 per year for every year of his adult life. So he has a lifetime of experience at evading the law and abusing the legal system to harass, threaten, intimidate, and even destroy other people financially for his own personal gain. On a personal level, Trump has 5 children by 3 different wives, a familial arrangement that many Americans normally associate with welfare queens, white trash, and the so-called breakdown of the traditional American family. His first wife claims that he raped her. This is a man who is unashamed to say on national television that he wanted to date his own daughter, called her a nice piece of ass on the Howard Stern show, told another 13-year-old girl at a beauty pageant that he would be dating her in a few years. He illegally diverted campaign funds to pay off a porn star and a Playboy model that he dated while his wife Melania was pregnant with his 5th child. Of course, his lawyer's in jail for that now. And of course, we all know about the grab him by the pussy comment caught on tape and replayed across the world. One can truthfully say that Donald Trump has failed at everything he has tried in life. He's lied about everything and everyone in his life. He has destroyed everything and everyone that he has come into contact during his 73 years on this planet. However, while Trump was a complete failure in the casino business, I would suggest he did learn 2 things from his time in that industry. First, what he learned was that business or government does not exist to provide a real good or service to its customers. It exists to fleece customers with false promises and caveat emptor. Second, he learned the importance of the skim. The boss always gets paid first by taking a skim off the top, and everyone else can stand in line with outstretched hands. That is how he has run every business he owns, and that is how he runs the U.S. government. Now, during his 3 years as the U.S. president, Trump has been called unhinged, erratic, this is just all from the newspapers, impulsive, inattentive, unpredictable, vindictive, petty, a pathological liar, a philanderer, a cheat, incompetent, untrustworthy, a threat to the American Republic, and a danger to the United States and the entire world. He's been called a fascist, a racist, a misogynist, a dictator, and a wannabe king. He has even been diagnosed publicly by reputable psychiatrists as suffering from narcissistic personality disorder and sociopathy. Now, these epithets are ultimately an effort to try to understand the Trump presidency. Why does he do the things that he does? It's an effort to make sense out of things that do not appear to make sense. I personally have no doubt that Donald Trump is all of those things, and I didn't even give you all of the quotes that I could have, but I think it's also typical of liberalism and bourgeois social science to deploy methodological individualism and to construct explanations that rely on individualistic assumptions. And what I would like to offer is a different kind of explanation that views the Trump administration through a more structural and institutional lens. And that the lens that I start with comes from Steve Bannon, which is that only a month after Donald Trump took office, his then chief political strategist, Stephen Bannon, declared, quote, "The new administration is in an unending battle for the deconstruction of the administrative state." Now, there's a long history to the meaning of that concept. We can talk about it later. I'll skip that for now. But the statement was widely reported in the media. But the media pundits, who were clearly unversed in post-structuralist and postmodernist political theory, were at a loss of what to make of this statement, and it quickly subsided, particularly when Bannon left the circle of Trump advisors early in the presidency. However, what I want to suggest is that in contrast to the many commentators who see Trump's actions as unhinged, erratic, and so forth and so on, that there is a certain rationality, in quotation marks, to his actions if you situate them and evaluate them against the concept of stateness developed by institutional state theorists. And what I want to argue is the Trump administration is in fact implementing the Bannon agenda by systematically deconstructing the American state and stripping it of its stateness. The long-term result, if it continues, will be a type of, I call it a postmodern political apparatus. I only use the term postmodern to mean the thing that comes after the modern. It doesn't have any other connotations. But basically it means that it will be unrestrained by the constitutional, administrative, and technocratic limits that had previously defined the modern liberal democratic state. Now in that respect, I want to emphasize that Trump did receive 63 million votes out of 128 million that were cast. He carried 31 states out of 50 in the Electoral College. And so I want to suggest that the Trump administration sits at the apex of a confluence of social forces, which each for different reasons sees the deconstruction of the administrative state as an advantageous political project that furthers its long-term interests. I won't have a lot of time to talk about this at the end, but these social forces include what I call the libertarian wing of the billionaire class, the so-called Elon Musk, Steve Mnuchin wing of that class, the ethno-nationalists as sort of exemplified by Stephen Bannon, and evangelical Protestants as exemplified by Jerry Falwell Jr. And there is some overlap among each of those groups that makes supporting the deconstruction of the state a common project for this movement. And that ironically, it is Trump's legacy of destruction, corruption, and failure that actually makes him the right person at the right place at the right time to represent this disparate right-wing coalition. So I start with then, well, what is the state? What is the modern state that is being constructed? And I begin quite simply with Weber's well-known definition of the state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Now, Weber emphasizes the notion that one of the characteristics that distinguishes a state from mere physical repression is the fact that a state's political domination of a given territory and people is considered legitimate by the underlying population, and therefore they acquiesce to its power. Weber suggests that historically there are three basic forms of legitimation. The first is tradition, or what he calls the authority of the eternal yesterday. The second is what he calls the extraordinary and personal gift of grace, a term that obviously has religious connotations. He refers to it as charisma. And the third is what he calls domination by legality, a belief in the validity of legal statutes and functional competence based on rationally created rules. Now, what distinguishes a state from other forms of political domination for Weber is its juridical rationalism, the rule of law, the belief that the modern servant of the state is there to promulgate public laws and to discharge their statutory obligations under those laws. So that if we carry that forward then for Weber, an essential characteristic of the state as an institution is that it has a repressive apparatus, the military, the police, and spies. It has a bureaucratic apparatus of literate and educated professionals, and a juridical apparatus of courts, judges, and lawyers. Now, however, as Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire, it is taxes that are the life source of the bureaucracy, the armies, the priests, and the court, and consequently, he says, strong taxes and strong government and heavy taxes are identical. Now, if we take that institutional structure, Weber goes on to suggest that juridical rationality in the modern state introduces another important distinction between what he calls the modern state and other forms of the pre-modern state. And that, he argues, is that all states may be classified as to whether they rest on the principle that the staff of men themselves own the administrative means, or whether the staff is separated from these means of administration. Now, essentially what he's talking about then is a distinction between the public and the private. That in the modern state, we not only talk about the separation of the economic from the political, the public from the private sector, but what we're talking about is the idea that political power and political authority is vested in public offices rather than private individuals. It is in the office of the presidency, not in Donald Trump or the King of England. Sovereignty and authority belong to the public office and not to the private person who exercises that power. And in liberal democracies, it's constitutions and statutes, et cetera, that sort of define the contours of those offices. And there's at least a nominal expectation that individuals holding these offices use that authority while pursuing some conception of the public interest rather than using it for private gain. And of course, we have all kinds of formal and informal requirements for disclosing taxes, ethics, conflicts of interest, a whole range of things that are designed to sort of enforce and manage that separation of the public and private. And there's just a whole list of things that I could go through. Public officials, in other words, in a modern state, do not owe personal loyalty to those who exercise political power, but as Weber puts it, obedience is expected in discharging statutory obligations. And a simple example of that that's being talked about a lot in the United States, for example, is that military officers, civil servants, and others, cabinet officers, do not swear their loyalty to the President of the United States. They swear their loyalty to the Constitution of the United States, that there is a separation of their office from the personal individual who holds it. So if that's the case, then I still return back to the question, well then, what is the state? And I could spend time at length going through this. If you've read Miliband, you know where I'm going. If you've read my book, you know where I'm going. But the main thing that Miliband, for example, and others have argued is that the state itself in the modern form is a really diffuse, massive, disjointed array to the point that it's sometimes difficult to even imagine thinking of it as the state. And as Miliband talks about it, there's really 5 apparatuses: the government, the administration, the coercive, the juridical, and the subcentral governments. And in fact, Miliband himself says that it's such a vast and sprawling network of institutions that the state is really just an analytical concept that we sort of throw over all these institutions to give them theoretical coherence. But he also does introduce a notion of the state as a set of interrelationships and a network of relationships between these institutions. And I think generally speaking, this has been one of the most under-theorized aspects in Marxist state theory in particular, as to what are the mechanisms that sort of integrate these various institutions and allow them to more or less function as a state. Now, we all know that, Miliband talked about things like common class origins and ideology. Later theorists like Fred Bloch, Klaus Offe, and Charles Lindblom talked about the dependency principle and business confidence. And all of those things talk about what gives the state coherence as a capitalist state, but they don't talk about what gives the state coherence as a state, as a network of political institutions. And I think still the most useful concept for addressing this was introduced by Stephen Skowronek in Building a New American State. I think it may be the only theoretical contribution the new institutionalists made to state theory, but I think it's a very important and neglected one, particularly by Marxists. And what he suggests is that stateness is an ongoing process of development that, of course, he calls political development, in which states build their strength across 3 levels of descending importance. One is what he calls the organizational orientations of government. The second is the procedural routines that tie these institutions together. And the third is the intellectual talents employed by the state. Now, I could go through each of these at some length. I'll try to just make this as short as possible. But the idea is that the more a state institutionalizes this network of relationships around procedures, around organizational orientations and the intellectual capacities of the state, the stronger it becomes as a state. Now, in many respects, the institutionalists have always argued that the American state is a weak state by design because it is federal and because it has a separation of powers. It does not meet the sort of analytical criteria of a strong state at that level. In fact, I was looking, Hegel, when he delivered his lectures on the philosophy of history in 1822, claimed that America did not have a, quote, real state at the time to fully embody what he called the spirit of its people. So he thought that the stateness of America and the realization of its spirit was in the future. In fact, other institutionalists like Richard Benzel have argued it took a civil war to finally concentrate state authority at the central or national level of a government. Skowronek talks about the building of administrative capacities after that. And others have pointed out that the stateness of the United States was really forged in the crucibles of World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, where the state capacities were finally fully centralized at the national level. You created this massive administrative and military apparatus, so you could actually argue that the United States did not fully achieve stateness until somewhere around 1945. And that's exactly when Dwight Waldo writes his book, The Administrative State. No coincidence in the timing. Now, the other thing has to do with these procedural routines, that this procedural level of state cohesion consists more of things like values, routines, precedent, customs, traditions that accrete over long periods of time. And there are many examples of such procedures that I think are relevant to understanding the Trump presidency. For example, that US presidents voluntarily release their income tax returns. That's a norm, it's an expectation, but it's not a legal requirement. The idea that presidents voluntarily put their personal assets into a blind trust while holding office. Again, it's a norm and an expectation, but it's not a requirement. There is a willingness of government officials to abide by advisory opinions of the Office of Government Ethics. Kind of required, but not really. Most do it, Trump doesn't. The willingness of executive officials to comply with congressional subpoenas, which Trump and all of his associates have flagrantly violated, refused to show up to deliver documents or testimony, outright illegal in that case, but Congress doesn't seem to have the willingness to send out the U.S. Marshals to arrest them. There's also a long tradition of U.S. ambassadors who are political appointees to sort of maintain the continuity of U.S. foreign policy by deferring to the expert opinions of professional foreign service personnel who may sit there in the number 2 and number 3 position under many presidencies, under many different political parties for purposes of maintaining the continuity of the policy with respect to that country. In the case of the Ukraine and other places we've seen, that's not the case with Trump. Now, finally, as Skowronek points out, the state is also as strong as the intellectual talent that it has available to it. And that talent, as he says, for solving problems, for innovation, allows a state to maintain itself over time. It's a problem of integrating intellectuals and experts into the state apparatus. It's irreducible. And one of the things where I now introduce Jürgen Habermas into this is that back when Habermas was still a political theorist, he made the observation that the bureaucratic apparatus does not really adhere to kind of the hierarchical model that Weber had described, what's called the old public administration. Dwight Waldo, when he introduced the concept of the administrative state, also introduced the concept of the politics of administration. And in many ways, what he did was lay out the same idea that Habermas had laid out, which the bureaucracy really consists of 3 types of personnel. There's the political, which I call the state elite. There are the bureaucratic and the techno-scientific, which I call state managers. Now, policy making and policy implementation is really a tripartite negotiation between political state elites, career bureaucrats, and scientific technical personnel that are embedded in every bureaucracy and every agency. State elites can be elected or appointed. They sit at the apex of the bureaucratic pyramids, They generally hold office for short periods of time. They may seek to redirect that apparatus with a new policy agenda, but ultimately, they are constantly checked and restrained and limited by career civil servants in the scientific technical apparatus in a couple of ways. One, of course, is that career civil servants are typically in the United States experts in public administration, law, management, accounting, finance, and budget. They're often key actors in providing policy advice to Congress, as well as to the president. They are also experts on organizational precedent, operational procedures, internal rules, protocols, laws, regulations. So they establish the continuity of policy, and they establish a restraint on what state elites, political state elites, can do in terms of not violating those norms and protocols and following those rules. They better understand the capacities of their agency. They know the talent, the skills, the budgets they have, and they may then put checks on policy initiatives by saying, we don't have the ability to do this, or we need to do it in a different way. Similarly, modern states are staffed by scientific technical personnel. And I can literally go from accounting to zoology. The government employs every discipline you can imagine, in every discipline. And there too, they sort of enunciate the scientific or technical consensus of a profession within the state, and they arbitrate what is scientifically true or false, so that they can act as checks on the political and ideological claims of state elites. They pose limits on what is scientific and technically feasible in the political realm. And these are what Trump refers to as the deep state. The deep state's not that deep, it's just the bureaucracy is really all it is. And of course, as we know, the bureaucracy always prefers incrementalism and continuity to radical disruptive change of any kind. Now that said, then I'm going to come back and say, what would it mean to deconstruct a state? If that's a state, and those are the types of things that network a state together and make it cohesive as a state, how do you deconstruct that apparatus? And I suggest that there are 5 things that you would do, and Trump is doing them all. The first thing you would do is you would remove the rational juridical basis of state legitimacy. The legitimacy of office holders and the legitimation of public policy initiatives would have to be dislodged and replaced with a different basis of legitimacy, such as tradition or charisma. The second thing you would do is abolish the separation of the public and the private. You would dissolve that distinction so that in fact the offices become the private property of office holders who use them for pecuniary gain and family enrichment. It would effectively require the normalization of what public administrators call corruption. Serious. That's the definition in public administration of corruption. The lifeblood of the state is taxes, so effectively to strip the state of its capacity to respond to crisis or the basic needs of population, you would need to diminish the state's physical capacity or exhaust them in some way. The established procedural orientations that regulate the relations between the various levels and branches of the state would have to be disrupted and ignored so that you effectively deconstruct the state's cohesiveness, not necessarily reduce the strength of the state, but alter its configuration and distribution within the state. And finally, you would need to remove the existing restraints on the actions and discourse of state elites. In other words, you would need to institutionally eliminate, debunk, and marginalize the state's career professional, scientific, and technical personnel, and preferably generate skepticism toward science and expertise in general, in order to reduce the state's intellectual capacity to again further undermine the legitimacy of their role in the state, which thereby allows state elites to pursue not only self-aggrandizing ideological possibilities, but to make statements that are patently untrue and to pursue them as if they were true. Just as an example, the next part of the state would then, part of the paper would then be going through each of those 5 things and giving you some examples of how Trump is doing those. I'll just use a couple of examples. Tell me when to stop. But I'll just give you a couple of examples of where I'm going with this. And I'll just start with the first one, which is juridical rationalism. rational legitimation of the state. Trump began his campaign by saying, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and I would not lose a single vote. Now, of course, the media goes, this guy's crazy. I would suggest that he was declaring his intent to redefine the legitimacy of the state on the basis of personal charisma. That I can do anything because I am special and my supporters will accept it. And he went on in many different iterations, and he still says it. I alone can fix it. I mean, if you look at Weber's definition of charisma, Trump is invoking all of those things. There is something special about me. I am the one. Even going further, not too long ago, if you remember this one, where he declares in a press conference, I am the chosen one. Even referring to himself as the King of Israel. Just one step from declaring he was the second coming of Jesus Christ. And if you have any doubts of this, his acquittal in the impeachment hearing by the U.S. Senate effectively ratifies the charismatic basis of his authority, saying that he can break the law openly in plain sight, and as long as he does the things that we want him to do, we don't have a problem with it, and his approval ratings have gone up. They are the highest they have ever been in his 3 years as President of the United States. Now, importantly, he can't do that alone. Right? He required the cooperation of the entire Republican Party in the U.S. Senate, -1, to accomplish that task. But I would suggest that it continues on. Another example of that would be the separation of public and private. Trump has systematically refused to release his income tax returns. Now, interestingly, they have no problem releasing Joe Biden's income tax returns and Hunter Biden's tax returns, but they have a case before the Supreme Court that the president is above this law. He doesn't have to do it. He has, of course, not put his assets into a blind trust as he promised to do, and we all know that while he makes a big deal out of donating his $400,000 salary as U.S. president, he has charged the U.S. government something like $350 million for the use of his golf resorts. Right? The guy's been golfing, 350, 400 times at this point. He charges the Secret Service $650 a night for the rooms, charges them for the golf carts they use to follow him around on the golf course. We know that public officials from other countries stay at the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. The Air Force was sending its people to a golf club in Scotland 100 miles away from where they needed to be, and I could go on and on. Ivanka Trump has received dozens of patents from the Chinese government as they're supposedly negotiating a trade deal. It goes on and on and on, where these are clear, flagrant violations of the Emoluments Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And yet, there's no point in pursuing it as yet another impeachment article has been proposed, because we know what the result's going to be as long as the Senate controls the House. So, and I could go on. I think the more interesting would be his relationship with the U.S. Department of Justice, where there's one where you really have lots of rules and protocols that have been established to kind of keep them at arm's length from the U.S. president, so that they don't function as the sort of attorney of the president. Those have all been broken down and just washed away. He started by firing many of the attorneys at the Southern District of New York, which are known to be aggressive and independent in their pursuit of political corruption. He's basically finally installed William Barr, who's one of the primary advocates of the theory of the unitary executive, which completely redefines the relationship between the three branches of government. And this is kind of a vulgar, simplistic statement about what that theory is. But in short terms, the theory of the unitary executive is that the president is sovereign because he is the only person elected by a national constituency in the United States. Everybody else represents a state or a local district. He's the only national figure. And therefore, all other branches of government are merely advisory to him. So it really just centralizes the power. And I could go through all 5 of these and give you just dozens of examples where I think he's doing these kinds of things to consolidate power around his person. And I think one of the really important ones, you know, he constantly jokes about, you know, being elected for a third and a fourth term or being president for life. But literally the day after his acquittal, any of those you who follow Twitter may have seen his tweet with the signs, Trump 2020, Trump 2024, Trump 2028, Trump 2032, openly declaring his intent that regardless of the outcome of the election, 5 years from now, I'm not leaving office. If I'm alive, I will still be the president, and I challenge any of you to take me on. Now, who would want that? And then I'll end. Just very briefly, as I said, I think there are three constituencies for this. What I call the libertarian wing of the billionaire class. If you want an insight into how these people think, I would recommend a book by James Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg called The Sovereign Individual. Rees-Mogg is actually the father of one of the leaders of the Brexit movement. And they basically have this very libertarian view of the information age in which they are truly and genuinely the titans of the earth. They do not need a state. The state is something that interferes with their genius. Democracy is a nuisance that needs to be done away with. They don't even need the state to print money because we have Bitcoin. And that they basically really have a view of the world in which states have become utterly unnecessary and a hindrance to the progress of the human race, and that the titans of the world should simply be allowed to master over it, and we will all be better off as a consequence. The second group, the ethno-nationalists, Steve Bannon, here I'd suggest, if you want an insight into his thinking, read some of the books by Alexander Dugin, who is one of the chief advisors to Vladimir Putin. His books are now available in English, published in Hungary by no coincidence, in English. You can only get them from Barnes & Noble. Amazon doesn't sell them. But basically, this is the view of a multipolar world in which there are these kind of ethno-nationalist regimes. And if I can again give a very short, kind of vulgarized version of this, you know, Dugin's argument is there is a natural hierarchy among people. So that kind of overlaps with the billionaire class. And that societies get disrupted when things like democracy interfere with the ability of this natural hierarchy to take its place. And he argues that every civilization has its own spirit, kind of Hegelian, that is best epitomized by its religion, which is Russian Orthodoxy in Russia, it's Hinduism in India, it's evangelical Protestantism in the United States. So you get the overlap with the religious conservatives in that. And that he envisions this kind of world of regional powers in which the United States has just sort of withdrawn into becoming a continental hemispheric power at best. And he essentially views Europe as a lost cause, that it's just going to disintegrate into what he calls postmodern decadence, with a little help from Russia. And of course, Russia then stands astride this because it's a Eurasian power, and he sees sort of a U.S., sort of a Moscow to D.C. axis, a Moscow to Tokyo, Moscow to Delhi, Moscow to Ankara, in which this Eurasian regional power sort of sits astride this network of alliances, and very much emphasizes the importance of disinformation and information warfare in disrupting the United States. And then finally, evangelical Christians. Well, I can't recommend a book to you because I suspect that many of them can't read, much less write. But if you watch cable TV, you'll get a good dose of that. Paula White's Prosperity Gospel, Pastor David Lynn's Christ Forgiveness Ministries, Jerry Falwell of Liberty University, and I could go on with the list, and I know this is going to sound crazy to you, but all of them share one thing in common, and that is that they want the rapture, the second coming of Christ, to happen in their lifetimes. And as we all know from the book of Revelations, the rapture is preceded by a period of utter chaos, disintegration, and destruction. And so even if you could convince them that Donald Trump is the Antichrist, they would say, good, because that means the rapture is coming. And the more destruction he creates, the better we are in the long run, because it takes us to the goal we want to achieve. Although many of them have said that, and in fact, Jerry, I saw this with my own eyes. Pat Robertson saying that to defy Trump was to defy God, literally. And that's the message. And so I think there is this widespread support with different reasons. And by the way, the billionaires got what they wanted. It was a $1.5 trillion tax cut, which has crippled the U.S. state financially. I don't know that we have the capacity to respond to anything should that become necessary. So I think that this does have roots within American civil society that are very deep and very strong. It's not going to go away when Donald Trump is not the president. It will still be there. Whether it's the 30, the 35, the 40, or the 46%, they will still be there. They're not going away. And then I think the real question that poses is, well, where do we go from here? Because it's a very scary time indeed.
Thank you. Well, as expected, you took us through a great tour of political theory, state theory, American politics, and so on. This is the first socialist meeting I've been to in a while which we had more discussion of the rapture than communism. That's okay. We'll throw it up. Maybe others will ask you the communist questions. Okay. Yeah.
How does China fit into this? I will just answer that question by referring to how Alexander Dugin sees it fitting in. Oddly enough, he almost never talks about China. He talks about a Moscow-Tokyo axis, a Moscow-Delhi axis, but he never talks about a Moscow-Beijing axis. Certainly, they constitute a culture and a civilization in the way that he defines it. My guess is he views them as a potential challenger in the new world order that he envisions, so he wants to discount them. Now, not being him, even if one embraced that, you would have to view China as potentially another one of those poles in this multipolar world, and they have sort of declared their intent to be the regional power rather than Japan. So I think that's partly just it. If I was to sort of read Dugin more realistically, I'd substitute China for Japan, but he doesn't do that. Now the other one was how about integrating institutionalism, and I will agree with you that institutionalism is very limited. I'm trying to incorporate it into the existing body of Marxist state theory to plug a hole, in my view, in that theory. And that hole is, what is the network of procedures, routines, and orientations, laws, statutes that weld all these disparate apparatuses together into a state, at least in defining the relationships between them. That's the only use that I see for that. I don't see it as substituting for anything else. And I think what you were trying to get at was that this coalition is much bigger than simply looking at a deconstruction of the state, and that's absolutely correct. That's the very end of the paper. I don't have a lot of time to deal with it, but I think that's a very important component of this, is to sort of analyze elements within the class structure and within civil society that generate this whole movement. I just haven't done that. Now that also leads to the cool-headed evangelicals.
Sabina's question.
Yes. And you're absolutely right. This evangelical movement goes back to the 20s. It gets a big spark in the 50s with the Billy Graham Crusades. Yeah, this goes way, way back. The America First phrase comes out of the 1930s from the American right wing back then. And you're right, there is sort of a cool-headed business establishment evangelicalism that sort of views religion as business, and that there's a coalition. I would not dispute that at all. I was just more interested in the crazies. I guess they make a better story. And I would agree with you that a lot of this is an attack on the welfare state. This whole sort of $1.5 trillion tax cut for billionaires, we know that game, right? This is the game that Reagan played. that you cripple the welfare state with these massive tax reductions to the wealthy, massive deficit financing, so that if the Democrats do come back into power, they're hamstrung by this debt, and they can't implement any of their goals in terms of abolishing student debt, Medicare for all those types of policies. And of course, not only Trump, but certainly Mitch McConnell have declared, that if they win re-election, the first order of business is we're going to cut back Medicare, cut back Medicaid, cut back on Social Security, because we just can't afford that stuff anymore. And that's most assuredly a part of it. And nothing irritates me like this. Is just an anecdote. We're watching TV one day. Here's some poor guy in Tennessee who's having his health care taken away when they were doing the Obama thing. And the reporter is asking him, you do understand you're going to lose your health care, right? This is a Trump supporter. He says, oh, yeah, I understand. But, Mr. Trump has to balance the budget. And it's like, he's not balancing the budget. He's not going to. And by the way, Trump has said deficits don't matter anymore anyway. I can do whatever I want. And they're already talking about another middle class tax cut, which we know will be, as they've defined it, is going to be, we're going to reduce the corporate tax rate again to now down to 20%. So the middle class tax cut will be another tax cut. So yeah, I think it's not just a deconstruction of the state, it's an elimination and a rollback of the welfare state. But I think there is something bigger going on than that, which is a dismantling of the very structure of the state. And that leads me to your questions, to the last ones. They all fall together pretty well, which has to do with a new type of administration and how they're doing this. I think, first of all, when I said the deep state is not that deep, what I was really trying to get at is it's not hidden. It's not this conspiratorial secret organization. The deep state is very deep. The bureaucracy is very deep. That's why it frustrates politicians so much, left as well as on the right, as you point out. And I think if Bernie Sanders was elected president, he would confront the exact same restraints and limitations on his powers as does a Donald Trump. Now, if you're a liberal, you would argue, well, that's the genius of the system, is that it eliminates the left and the right, keeps everything in the nice moderate center where they want it. But I think they are looking at a different kind. I call it a political apparatus instead of a state. And I'll just use this as the example. There is a lot of legal theory out there on the administrative state. The conservatives, including people like William Barr, will argue in legal journals that the administrative state, by definition, is unconstitutional in the United States because the administration is making laws and regulations. They're exercising authority that is never given to them explicitly in the Constitution. So the whole administrative state is unconstitutional and needs to be eradicated. And yet on the same next page, they'll be arguing for the theory of the unitary state, which is the president has absolute power, is above the law, and so how does that mean they relate to the administration that's left? Well, this is where I go back to the charismatic authority, that what Trump is trying to do is establish that their loyalty is to him personally. And kind of one of the best examples of this has been the way he has played around with police forces and the military to try to rupture the relationship between the rank and file and the professional officer corps, who emphasize things like rules of engagement, there's a Miranda warning and all these kinds of things. And here's like just an emblematic example of that. This guy was recently, I forgot his name, convicted of war crimes in Iraq. I think it was in Iraq. Not only after he's prosecuted does Trump pardon him, after he's convicted, pardon him, invites him to Mar-a-Lago, puts him on the stage, announces that he is going to campaign with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump makes it very clear that if you're a rogue military, that if you kill innocent civilians, including children, I have your back. I'm your man. But your loyalty is to me. And then turns around and the people, the military prosecutors, had all of their medals stripped from them. That he didn't just honor the criminal, he dishonored the people who had prosecuted them to sort of strike the terror that you leave these people alone, right? It then tells policemen, ignore your captain, go ahead, bang their head against the car, I don't care. So I think what he's trying to do is say, I want this kind of lawless, rogue administration so long as it is loyal to me, takes orders from me, and eliminates this sort of intermediate strata of professional career bureaucrats, military officers, scientific experts, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm calling it a political apparatus for lack of a better term, but I don't think it's a state in the sense that Weber would define a modern administrative state. Now, Bannon, we might disagree on this. I think Bannon doesn't want American hegemony. I think Bannon wants the United States to retreat back into being a continental hemispheric power, get us out of NATO, get us out of all these international treaties, disband the WTO, and sort of cultivate our own garden as kind of an ethno-Christian state. And I think he'd be perfectly fine with that. I think he's completely in tune with Dugin, and he's over in Europe trying to, I think where he's anti-Dugin or non-Dugin is when he goes to Europe to say, well, wait, Europe's not really a lost cause. I can salvage it. There's lots of right-wing ethno-nationalist movements over there in Poland and France and Hungary that I can bring to the forefront and create this kind of system in Europe too. These are all really good questions, and some of them I'm going to just have to confess that I haven't fully thought them through, or I don't completely have well thought out answer to them, but I'll do so as best I can. One was whether this is a continuation of a long process of neoliberalization or a break with neoliberalization. This kind of ties into Leo's question as well. As I read Trump, this is a break with neoliberalism. That which neoliberals depends on the rule of law, predictability, et cetera, no protectionism, global markets. I see that if this continues, this is a break with that, and I'll just leave it at that. It's something fundamentally different. And of course, that's going to have all kinds of global repercussions in terms of global reproduction of capital accumulation, the United States' role as sort of the protector of private property around the world, the policeman of the empire, et cetera. And sort of, I'll come back to that one, but that's kind of the foreign policy stuff. The questions were a couple really that involve Bernie Sanders, and yes, there is a more vigorous left in the United States than there has ever been in my lifetime, probably since the 1910s with Eugene Debs. It is clearly much weaker than the far right, and so it's getting a late start. And I don't know what happens if Bernie Sanders wins the election. And we could go through all the scenarios for why that won't happen, starting with he'll be sabotaged by the Democratic Party at all costs, and they will do anything to stop him. That if he did win an election, he's going to face the same deep state coming at him from the other direction, probably just as vigorously. And this is why in Trump's case, Mitch McConnell has 450 bills passed by the House sitting on his desk that he will not release because he is focused single-mindedly on approving judges. They are filling vacancies as fast as they can, and they are reconstructing the American judiciary with people that all lawyers, most lawyers, clearly view are unqualified to hold the office, regardless of their ideology, are not qualified to be judges, but they're political hacks, and they will sign off on anything that Donald Trump and the Republican Party say they want to do and declare it constitutional. And Bernie Sanders would face that judiciary. Now, the question would be, does he just do like Trump says and goes, well, judges don't make law, I don't care what they do. And then we're in kind of the same scenario, just on the left instead of the right. So yeah, it's a very difficult situation that he's going to face. Now, how much power do evangelicals have? This is a question I address all the time in my intro American government class. If you look at the World Values Survey, comes out every year, the United States is one of the most religious countries in the world in terms of very, very fundamental beliefs. Creationism. 40% of Americans don't believe the theory of evolution. Many states requiring that creationism be taught alongside evolution as just one other theory of the origins of the human species. It is deep, even if it's not the crazy evangelicals, it is a deep thread in American culture, and it is very powerful. And that's why Trump, I think, invokes these religious themes so consistently, because they resonate with people in ways that they probably don't even understand. And so that then goes to the next question. Attributing to Trump long-term structure. I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying to start with Trump and work my way out. There's only so far out I can go in the short time available to me in a presentation or in a paper, which is now becoming a book, it looks like, because I have to answer all these questions. So yeah, I think this is long-standing, there's no question. The theory of the unitary presidency at least goes back to Edwin Meese in 1980s, when he was trying to defend Reagan against the Iran-Contra scandal. And by the way, William Barr was right there in the Justice Department with him, developing that theory at the time. So this does go a long ways back. This whole rise of the reconstruction of presidential power has deep roots. But I think what is new and unique is the rupture with rational legal legitimacy and just the abandonment of any effort to anchor this in some precedent or tradition of constitutional law and to vest it in the person of Donald Trump. That, I think, is new and unique. Absolutely agree with your critique, Leo. I purposely, in this case, dealt with this Weberian concept of the state and didn't get into the larger structural issues of how is this related to the development of capitalism, what will its impact and what will its impact be domestically and globally. But as I said, I do think that this agenda is a break with neoliberalism. It is a break with the idea of the United States as a global superpower and the policeman of the empire. And that's why I raised the question at the very beginning of, what does the world look like after the American empire? What does capitalism look like after the American empire? And I don't have the answers to those questions. I think those are the questions that we'll have to face. But I will say one thing about that. There was an interesting article in Jacobin not too long ago where they talk about this, which is that in funneling all the benefits to this kind of parasitic, unproductive criminal capital, the state is not fulfilling its role in reproducing the interests of capital as a whole. From the standpoint of capitalism, this is a dysfunctional regime and a dysfunctional state. And the question would then be, well, is there some segment or fraction of capital that's going to step in and stop this and say, you're blowing up the whole system that we've created? I keep hoping so, oddly enough, but we haven't seen it yet. And I don't know where we're going to see it or if we're going to see it. And it's odd, right, as a Marxist say, I hope the finance capitalists step in and put a stop to this crazy stuff. But it hasn't happened yet. And I do think this goes all the way through the Republican Party now. I think that is the thing that makes this even scarier, is how deep it has gone into the Republican Party, municipal police departments. In the paper, I didn't say it here, but in the paper I refer to ICE and the Border Patrol as Trump's Society of the 10th of December, referring to the Brumaire. This is his lumpen proletarian cadre of thugs that they use to enforce their policies. And I could even go on, like, the violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the use of the U.S. Army for police duties. Well, they stuck them on the border to police the border. What people don't realize is that by law, the U.S. border goes 100 miles deep. The place I live, the Rio Grande Valley, is basically an occupied zone at this point, with the U.S. Army out putting up razor wire in our country. And what does this mean for Canada? Man, it's not good.
So I think we'll end it there. We've got a little bit of the political economy of the rapture as viewed from the Rio Grande. Thank you, Clyde, for your presentation.